Welcome to the channel Dark Slavery Stories. Today's story comes from the year 1850. It is the story of Mercy Whitfield, a young black girl who crossed the river 14 times. The current was powerful, the night was cruel, and each time she returned, she was carrying giants. This is a heavy story. Take a breath and listen carefully. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city and country you are listening from. Your presence helps keep these stories alive so they are never forgotten. Let us begin. In the winter of 1850, along the frozen edges of the Ohio River, something impossible was happening. Night after night, under skies so dark you could not see your own hand, men were vanishing from the Kentucky side and appearing in Ohio. These were big men, strong men, field workers with shoulders wide enough to carry 200 pounds of cotton. These were men who had never learned to swim and who feared the water more than they feared the whip. Yet, every single one of them was being led by a child. Her name was Mercy Whitfield. She was 11 years old, she weighed only 63 pounds, and she would become one of the most successful conductors on the Underground Railroad that history never fully recorded. In 1850, the Ohio River was not just water, it was a border between two completely different worlds. On the southern side was Kentucky, a slave state where people were bought and sold like animals. On the northern side was Ohio, a free state where those same people could walk without chains. The distance between slavery and freedom was sometimes less than 1,000 feet, but those 1,000 feet of dark, cold, rushing water might as well have been a massive ocean. The river was unpredictable. In some spots it was shallow enough to walk across, but in others the current could pull a grown man under in seconds. The bottom was filled with debris, fallen trees, sharp rocks, and the bones of those who had tried to cross and failed. Local fishermen knew the dangers and respected the water. Many refused to work there after sunset, but for enslaved people desperate for freedom, the Ohio River was the only way out. In 1850, that path became more dangerous than ever. On September 18th, the United States Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act. This law changed everything. Before this, if an enslaved person reached a free state, they had a decent chance of starting a new life. The laws were messy and not always followed. Many northern communities refused to help slave catchers. The Fugitive Slave Act destroyed that safety. Under this new law, federal officials were placed in every county to handle cases of runaways. These officials were paid $10 for every person they sent back to slavery, but only $5 if they set them free. The money was a clear incentive to be cruel. The law also forced ordinary citizens to help capture runaways. Anyone who refused could be fined $1,000 and put in jail for 6 months. Anyone caught helping a runaway faced even worse punishment. Overnight, the entire North became a hunting ground. Professional slave catchers flooded the banks of the Ohio River. They set up camps, paid informants, and watched every bridge and ferry crossing. They knew desperate people would try to cross, and they were waiting. In Ripley, Ohio, a small town across from Kentucky, the slave catchers were very active. Ripley was known as a major station on the Underground Railroad. The town sat on a hill, and at the top stood a house with a lantern that burned every night. That light was a signal telling runaways that help was waiting. The slave catchers watched that light and counted the people going up the hill. However, they never watched the water itself the way they should have. 3 miles down the river from Ripley, the Ohio curved sharply to the west at a place locals called the Devil's Elbow. The current there was strange, creating whirlpools that could spin a boat in circles. The banks were thick with willow trees and roots that reached into the water like fingers. During floods, debris piled up and created underwater traps that could drown a person. Nobody crossed at the Devil's Elbow because it was too dangerous. Slave catchers didn't even bother to patrol it. That was their mistake. There was one person who knew the Devil's Elbow better than anyone. One person who had spent years studying the currents, memorizing hidden paths, and learning which rocks were stable. That person was an 11-year-old girl named Mercy. She was born in 1839 on a tobacco plantation owned by Cornelius Whitfield. Mercy never knew her mother, who died giving birth to her. Her father had been sold and sent to Mississippi months before she was born. In the world of slavery, families were broken apart constantly. Mercy was raised by an old man named Moses. He was 62 and had survived 3 owners and outlived 7 of his own children. Moses had one valuable skill. He knew how to cure tobacco perfectly. Because of this, Cornelius Whitfield kept him around. Moses took Mercy under his wing. From the time she could walk, she followed him everywhere. She learned to judge tobacco leaves and tend the fires. But in whispers, Moses also taught her about the river. He had grown up near the Ohio and had tried to cross it twice in his youth. He was caught and beaten both times, but he never forgot the patterns of the water. He mapped the river in his head for 40 years and passed that map to Mercy. By the time she was 9, she knew the Devil's Elbow perfectly. She would sneak out at night and wade into the water to feel the current. She learned where the bottom was solid and how to read the ripples on the surface. Her body was small but very tough. She could hold her breath for 2 minutes and move through the water without making a sound. When she was 10, she crossed the river alone just to prove she could do it, then she crossed back. She had found a secret power that belonged only to her. The year 1850 brought the Fugitive Slave Act, and the Whitfield plantation felt the change. Cornelius Whitfield was happy about the law, hoping to get back lost property. His 19-year-old son, Thomas Jr., was even worse. While Cornelius used violence as a business tool, Thomas enjoyed it. He looked for reasons to hurt people. In November 1850, Thomas decided to send a message by accusing Moses of stealing food. It was a lie, but it didn't matter. They tied Moses to a post and Thomas gave him 30 lashes. For an old man, it was almost a death sentence. Moses survived, but he was broken. Cornelius decided Moses was no longer useful and sold him to a harsh planter in Mississippi. The sale was set for December 15th. Mercy heard the news on December 8th. She had only 7 days to act. She decided she was going to save him. Her plan relied on a secret. At the sharpest part of the Devil's Elbow, there was a hidden sandbar about 3 feet underwater. It created a narrow path, only 18 inches wide in some places. If a person followed it exactly, they could cross the river without swimming. The water would never go above their chest. On the night of December 12th, 3 days before the sale, Mercy moved. She waited until the plantation was silent and went to Moses's cabin. She didn't explain, she just took his hand. It took them 2 hours to walk the 3 miles to the river because Moses was so weak. When they reached the water, Moses was terrified. The river reminded him of his past failures. Mercy simply squeezed his hand and led him into the freezing December water. The cold was biting, but Mercy stayed calm. Moses struggled, but Mercy stood upstream to break the current for him with her small body. She guided him inch by inch along the hidden sandbar, walking backward and placing his feet for him. It took 45 minutes to cross. When they finally reached the Ohio side, Moses collapsed. Mercy hid him under branches and leaves to keep him warm as the sun began to rise. They had done the impossible. Moses was in a free state, though the new law meant they were still in great danger. Safety was not the same as being safe. The Fugitive Slave Act meant that slave catchers could chase runaways anywhere they went. Moses had to keep moving. He needed to reach Canada, the only place where American law could not touch him. Mercy knew she could not take him that far. She was only 11 years old and had to return to the plantation before sunrise. If she were missing, people would ask questions. If they connected her to Moses's escape, the consequences would be terrible. So she did the only thing she could do. She pointed Moses toward the town of Ripley, told him to look for the lantern on the hill, and then slipped back into the water. The return crossing was much harder. She was exhausted. The freezing water had stolen her energy. The current felt stronger going back than it had going out. But she made it. She crawled out of the water on the Kentucky side just as the first morning light appeared. She was shaking so hard she could barely walk. Her fingers were white and her lips were blue. She managed to get back to the slave quarters and collapsed on her bed, pulling a thin blanket over her wet clothes. When the overseer came at dawn to wake the workers, Mercy was lying there, appearing to be asleep. No one suspected a thing. 3 days later, when Cornelius Whitfield found out Moses was gone, he was furious. He sent riders in every direction and hired slave catchers. He offered a reward of $200, which was a huge amount of money in 1850. They never found Moses. Months later, Mercy heard through the secret whispers of other enslaved people that Moses had made it to Canada. He was living in a town called St. Catherine's, working for a carpenter. He was free, Mercy had done something impossible. She had guided a broken old man across one of the most dangerous rivers in America, in the middle of winter, in total darkness. She realized she could do it again. Word spread quietly through the plantation and beyond. There was a way across the river. There was a path the slave catchers didn't know about. There was someone who could guide you. No one knew the guide was an 11-year-old girl. People who saw her saw only a child. They didn't expect anything from her. That was why it worked. The second crossing happened in January. The man's name was Samuel. He was a giant, over 6 feet tall and weighing 240 pounds. He worked in the tobacco fields and had massive hands. Samuel had tried to escape twice before by swimming, but the current had almost killed him. He was terrified of the water, but he was more terrified of living in chains. When he heard about the path at the Devil's Elbow, he found Mercy. At first, he didn't believe it. He looked at this small child and couldn't imagine she held his freedom in her hands. But Mercy spoke with such confidence that he listened. She described the path, the current, and the sandbar in detail. They crossed on a night with no moon. The darkness was so thick Samuel couldn't see Mercy in front of him. He could only feel her small hand pulling him forward. When the water reached his chest, he panicked, but Mercy squeezed his hand and kept him steady. She didn't hesitate. It took over an hour, but they made it. Samuel fell to his knees and cried on the other side. He had been saved by a child who barely reached his waist. He tried to thank her, but she was already back in the water. She had to return before dawn. Samuel reached Canada 6 weeks later and eventually started a family in Toronto. He never forgot the girl who saved him. The third crossing happened in February and the fourth in March. By April, Mercy had guided 6 men across. Each man had his own fears and reasons for running. Some were young, some were old. Mercy treated them all the same. She held their hands and guided their feet through the dark. She never got caught. Part of her success was the location. The Devil's Elbow was so dangerous that slave catchers avoided it. They never thought anyone would be brave enough to cross there. Her size also helped. She was invisible to the adults around her. And finally, her skill was unmatched. She could feel the river's changes through her feet and navigate by instinct. By the summer of 1851, Mercy had completed 10 crossings. 10 men had reached Ohio because of her. The plantation was in chaos. Cornelius Whitfield couldn't understand how he had lost so many people in 1 year. It was a financial disaster and made him feel like he had lost control. He hired more guards and built new fences, but the escapes continued. His son, Thomas Jr., believed someone on the inside was helping the runaways. He watched everyone closely and punished anyone who seemed suspicious. Yet, he never suspected Mercy. She was just a quiet, hard-working child. The 11th crossing was Gabriel, a preacher who had taught himself to read. His master planned to whip him almost to death for his secret church services, so he ran. When he met Mercy, he fell to his knees and prayed for her. Mercy wasn't religious, but Gabriel's faith was powerful. They crossed during a summer storm that had made the river swell. The sandbar had shifted, but Mercy adjusted and led him across. Gabriel made it to Canada and started a church. He often preached about the angel who led him through the waters. As winter returned in 1852, the legend grew. People whispered about a ghost or a spirit at the Devil's Elbow that led people to freedom. By January, Mercy had completed 14 crossings, but the winter of 1852 was brutal. The river began to freeze, and ice chunks floated in the water like knives. Mercy knew she should stop, but people were desperate. In February, she agreed to help a blacksmith named Isaac. He was being sold away from his wife and children. They set out in weather that was 8 degrees below zero. The river was a nightmare of ice and shifting currents. Halfway across, Isaac slipped and almost pulled Mercy down with him. They both nearly died, but Isaac found his footing. When they reached the other side, Mercy collapsed from the cold. Isaac carried her to shelter and used his own body heat to keep her alive. That night, Mercy decided she was finished. 14 crossings were enough. She had pushed her luck too far. She returned across the river, nearly dying from the cold and exhaustion. She reached the Kentucky bank as dawn broke and crawled back to her cabin. She slept for 2 days. When she woke up, her body felt different. Her lungs hurt, and her fingers and toes tingled from frostbite. She believed her work was done. But 3 months later, things got worse. Cornelius Whitfield was dying. and Thomas Jr. took full control. He was much more cruel than his father. In May 1852, Thomas targeted a house servant named Ruth because she could read. He believed she was the one helping the runaways. He interrogated her for 3 days and then whipped her 30 times, even though she knew nothing. Mercy watched from a distance, feeling a terrible guilt. Ruth was being punished for Mercy's actions. A cold, hard hatred began to grow inside the young girl. She realized that Thomas was the true monster. In July, Cornelius died, and Thomas inherited everything. He became a tyrant, whipping people for the smallest mistakes. 3 people died that summer from his cruelty. Mercy watched and waited. Her heart was no longer just focused on saving people, it was focused on the man with the whip. The plantation became a place of total terror, and Mercy watched. She watched, she waited, and she planned. She didn't have a specific goal yet, but she knew something was coming, something that would change everything. In September, she found out what it was. Thomas Whitfield Jr. had made a massive mistake. He had cheated a man named Harrison Cole, one of the most ruthless slave catchers in the region. Thomas refused to pay Cole the full bounty for capturing a runaway. Cole left with a promise. One day, their positions would be reversed, and Thomas would be the one in chains. Everyone thought it was an empty threat because Thomas was a white plantation owner. But they were wrong. In October 1852, a court ruled that Thomas was not entirely white. Harrison Cole had dug into the family history and found that Thomas's great-great-grandmother, Delilah, had been an enslaved woman. Under the cruel laws of 1852, 1 drop of black blood made a person eligible for slavery. Thomas was legally black. A federal marshal arrived and arrested Thomas in his own home. He was put in the same chains he had used on others. Cole intended to sell him to a cotton plantation in Mississippi. However, Cole underestimated the river. While waiting to cross, a violent storm hit. The Ohio River rose rapidly, the camp was destroyed, and Thomas, still in chains, was swept into the water toward the Devil's Elbow. Mercy heard the river calling and walked through the storm. At dawn, she found Thomas caught in willow roots, struggling to stay above the surface. She could have let him drown. It would have been justice for Moses and Ruth. But then she saw a medallion around his neck, her mother's medallion, stolen years ago. She realized that to get it back, she had to save him. She stepped into the wild, angry water. The sandbar she knew was gone, shifted by the flood. She reached Thomas, untangled his chains, and began to pull him across. This crossing was unlike any other. There was no path to follow, only her instincts and the heavy weight of a man who had caused so much pain. Halfway across, her body began to fail. The cold was stealing her life, but she thought of her mother and the giants she had saved before. She refused to let the river take her. When they finally reached the Ohio side, she dragged Thomas onto the bank and took the silver medallion from his neck. Thomas was terrified, realizing his life was now in the hands of the girl he had treated as property. Mercy told him he was free because Ohio law wouldn't recognize Cole's claim. She told him his punishment was to live every day knowing a slave girl had chosen to let him exist. She told him to go to Canada and try to become someone worth saving. Mercy returned to Kentucky as the sun rose. She held her mother's medallion and smiled for the first time in months. Thomas did go to Canada and worked as a laborer, never owning another person again. The Whitfield plantation fell apart, and Mercy was sold to a place in Tennessee, but she wasn't finished. She learned the Tennessee waterways and joined the Underground Railroad network in Nashville. From 1853 to 1865, she guided an estimated 67 people to freedom. People called her the Water Angel or Moses's daughter. When the Civil War ended, Mercy settled in Cincinnati. She worked as a laundrywoman, living a quiet life. Wealthy families never knew she had been a legendary conductor. Sometimes the children of those she saved would visit, and she would show them her medallion and tell them about the Devil's Elbow. Mercy died in 1903 at age 64. Her gravestone doesn't mention the river, but the people she saved never forgot her. History might not have recorded her name in textbooks, but her victory remains. She turned the river, the very thing the system feared, into a weapon for freedom. She found a path where others saw only death. Mercy didn't just cross from slavery to freedom, she crossed from hatred to peace. She proved that the world changes through small acts of impossible courage, repeated over and over. The river flows on, and every ripple carries the memory of the girl who changed the world, one crossing at a time.